That's where we kind of go wrong, is we meet a couple of introverts and we go, oh, well, they're really quiet and they're really shy, so therefore all introverts must be quiet and shy. And that's
even I thought that, even though I've been listening to you this whole time, I'm still in my mind, I'm like, yeah, introvert, shy. So yeah, there's a lot of work to be done out here. Yeah, I mean, or maybe I'm the only one who's like super dense, but it's just like,
no, it's quite common. It's very common.
Because it is, but you're right. Like if you were in a circle and you're comfortable, suddenly people like they come out of their shells. And the same with, and I guess extroverts, they're not necessarily always the loud ones, right?
No, exactly. Yeah, because that's another misunderstanding, that extroverts are loud.
Welcome back. We are on today with my guest Jenn Turnham, who is back for a second time on the Tour for the Ship podcast. I'm your host, Angie Sorensen. I can't believe there's only 1 week left until I start the next cohort of the podcasting workshop, the Create and Release Your First Podcast session, which starts next week. And registration closes on Friday. And listen, I would love to have you on board if you are just like the previous students who've been on it. You're just dying to get your podcast out and you just want to do it with ease and you're just done with procrastinating this whole podcasting thing. You can come and join me and my next group. Also, one of the things that make this course just so amazing is that there's a lot of practical hours. We do like accountability hours together. So you will actually learn how to edit audio live with me. We literally go step by step. So you actually practice before you finish this course. So we have at least 4 sessions literally dedicated to just like learn practically how to edit audio, how to master it, how to export it, all of those technical bits that are what a lot of people look sort of procrastinate about or worried about. So we'll dedicate, our live Zoom calls to things like that, but also to brainstorming, to all the questions that you may have. And, this is how like over the course of the 6 weeks, you end up with your actual podcast, because we go through this process step by step and I'll literally tell you exactly what to do. And as a listener, you get 15% discount. That is just for you, the listeners. You can use the code LISTEN15, LISTEN15, when you sign up to get your 15% off. So if you want to join us, go to learnpodcasting.online and scroll down to select Create and Release Your First Podcast in 6 weeks and on a budget. I've also included a link in the show notes with the discount code for you, the listeners. So I absolutely can't wait for you to join. I'm so excited. Absolutely love doing this. It is so much fun. So hopefully I'll see you there. I am closing registration on Friday, because we need time to hop on a private call, you and I, before you start, and making sure that you're up to speed with everything before we start our first group live call on the Wednesday. So I'd love to see you there. And, it's my pleasure to do this. I love creating a community of future peers of podcasters. Honestly, it's so much fun. So if you like the show, don't forget to give a 5-star rating and review, and be sure to tell all your friends. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or wherever you're listening to right now, Spotify. The more you do that, the more it helps new listeners discover this show. So in today's episode with Jenn, it's our second and last part on the highly sensitive people, aka HSPs. Today we've layered it with the added components of introverts and extroverts, and why that's important to understand in how we process our lives and what we need to manage it. So without further ado, let's begin. Well, welcome back, Jenn.
Thank you for having me again.
Yes, no, I'm so excited. Look, it was pretty clear last week. There was so much more to unpack, and as you know, like I just really like to get into the stuff and find out what's going on and make sure we understand everything. So thank you for coming back. And so last week, for those who Well, actually, if you want to listen to I think you could probably listen to this episode on its own. But if you want to have context, if you go back to last week where we covered highly sensitive people, what their character traits are, and so today we're going to go into the difference between introvert, extrovert, and ambivert. So that hopefully is going to start to make a little bit of context. We can start to layer those two together, because some people are highly sensitive extroverts and some people are highly sensitive introverts. And Jen's speciality is the highly sensitive extroverts. But I sort of wanted to put a bit of, we wanted to put a little bit of dimension so we could see what the difference was. So just really quickly, Jenn, if I say quickly, don't do it quick, but if you could just for those who don't know you, please introduce yourself, what you do and where you live.
Okay, well, thanks for having me back. My name's Jenn Turnham, and I am a highly sensitive extrovert coach, and I am from Perth, Western Australia.
Perfect. In about 30 seconds, we're going to go into you're going to go into and explain to us the difference between introvert, extrovert, and ambivert. And so just before we do that, I just want to do a quick recap. Like, this is going to be super miniature recap of last week, what an HSP is. There's 4 components that comes from the Eileen-Aron scale. It's the scale that Eileen-Aron created, and it's the DOES. And the D stands for depth of processing, which means that, a lot of us can be kind of exhausted about our thoughts. It's like, what we call the monkey mind, constantly having something on our mind. The O stands for overstimulation, which is overactive nervous system. So easy overwhelmed by clutter, longer journey, that kind of stuff. Obviously, correct me, Jenn, if I'm wrong.
Also, big one in that is also noise and crowds.
That went in there too. Oh yes, yep. Noise, crowd, and then I guess lights as well.
Yep.
Okay, yes. So for those of us who like to sleep with our eye mask on, even though it's dark, welcome to the club. E is for emotional response and reactivity. So our high are higher, our lows are lower. And it also is empathy, but it does not necessarily mean empath. And as you can hear, Jenn, she lives in Australia, so she has a complete wonderful nature behind her. I'm not going to ask them to be quiet. They're just wonderful. I think those are birds. Are they birds?
Yeah, they were galahs, yeah.
Galahs. Even the name is nice. Okay. So the galahs. Over here we have pigeons. Not this. Galahs. Okay. So I love the galahs. Okay. So empathy, but it does not mean you are an empath. However, empath can be HSPs as well. And then the S stands for sensitive to subtleties. That means that we pick up on minute facial expression. We are also sensitive to sort of like cold and heat. Is this right? Yeah?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So, but if you want the more funnier version, more nice version, go to last week's episode. This was like a little bit like a webinar that I just did to you, so sorry. But there you go. So I think like we're all kind of caught up. And Jenn, please, the floor is yours now. Please explain to us, what is the difference between introvert, extrovert, and ambiverts?
Okay. All right. Well, to make it as simple as we can, I'll start with the differences between introverts and extroverts. And once I've covered that, then we'll tackle the subject of ambiverts. So there's about 3 or 4 main differences between introverts and extroverts. So first of all is where we focus. So introverts have a very internal focus. So they have a very active internal world. Whereas extroverts, their focus is outwards. So they're always craving sensory stimulation, new experiences. And the reason for that is there's some brain science that suggests that extroverts are less sensitive to dopamine, which is a reward chemical in the brain, which is why we're forever out there looking for novel experiences, looking for that external stimulation. Whereas introverts prefer the reward chemical of acetylcholine, which is slightly different, and so they don't need to go seeking the dopamine. And I actually came across a study just recently that was published in the Frontiers in Human Neuroscience journal, and they were actually they did the study at Cornell University in New York, and they were studying the effects of Ritalin, which is the drug commonly prescribed for ADHD. So the effects of Ritalin on the dopamine system. And what Ritalin does is it stimulates the release of dopamine, which is known to play a role in reward and motivation. And interestingly, the introvert brains didn't translate that into reward or motivation. So what they concluded from the study is that the brains of introverts weigh internal cues much more strongly than external motivation and reward cues. So that kind of fits with that whole extroverts seek those dopamine hits because it's reward and it's motivation, whereas introverts' brains are not driven by the same desire for that dopamine. So that's pretty interesting.
Does that mean that introverts have higher level of dopamines in their body, or they're just more sensitive to it, so they feel it more, so they don't need to have the external input?
That's what I've seen in the research. The studies that I've read is that, extroverts are less sensitive, whereas it's like introverts kind of already get enough from the dopamine that they don't need to go and search out more hits of dopamine, if that makes sense.
For the introverts?
Yeah, whereas the extroverts are constantly out there looking for the next hit of dopamine because it comes from an external place.
And so in layman terms, like, does this translate into, like, that's why, like, maybe extroverts are more out there social and introverts will maybe more tend to be at home reading a book?
Yes, that would make sense. Yeah, and it's also why extroverts are involved in heaps of different activities. They volunteer to be on committees because they're always out for that external novel situations, whereas an introvert is quite happy in their own space, in their own world, and too much external stimulation for an introvert then just becomes overwhelming. So the other big difference between them is where we get our energy from. So the way I like to describe it is it's like where we, if we were a mobile phone, where we would plug in to get charged. Now, introverts get their energy from within. So if they spend too much time out in an externally stimulating environment, they get kind of almost overcharged and then they get drained of energy. And that's because they have an inbuilt charging system within them. So they essentially can plug their phone cord into themselves to recharge them, whereas extroverts need to find an external power source to plug in to get energy. So we get our energy from the environment. We need time with others in a sensory stimulating environment in order to recharge our batteries. And that doesn't mean, and one of the common misconceptions here is that introverts don't like people, which is something that I wanted to address because that's not it at all. Because the other thing is that they don't like parties. The difference is that introverts would much prefer to go to a party and they're more likely to sit with a couple of people that they feel comfortable with and they get along with, and they'll spend a lot of time just chatting and having in-depth conversations with those 2 or 3 people, whereas an extrovert is much more likely to be kind of flitting around the room, meeting new people and getting that all those kind of different stimulus coming at them to give them that external stimulation that they're craving.
But so this is interesting because, like, the first bit, like where the focus was, is almost where I sort of almost translated to where we sort of get our happiness from, or, you know, where we draw the happiness from almost, because you said, like, you mentioned about introverts when they're in their own space, they're happy, right? And then you said, and then the second bit is the energy source where we get our energy. And it's interesting because for me, that's almost the same thing. Like if I'm energized, I'm usually happy, unless I'm angry, right? Because that's also energizing. But it's like, I just, you know, listening to you, and I know that when we've had our own conversation, it's like, you know, I know you've mentioned that I'm probably extrovert. And I'm like, no, I'm introvert.
Yes, the ongoing debate.
Yeah, exactly. And then I was just, but then when I was listening to you now, I was like, I wrote down this sentence and I was like, what do we fall into? Does not always mean that that's who we are. So for example, you mentioned about the parties. I think sometimes I do fall into because I quite like deep conversations, and I'll start having a conversation with one person and I almost like feel trapped. Depends. Sometimes I'm really enjoying it. Like don't be, this guy, it's terrible. But so sometimes I'll be like actually in a party and I'll have one conversation, great conversation with one person. But at some point I'm like, I'm actually kind of ready to move on a little bit. I want to see who else is out there, especially if I'm single or if I'm out at a fun party, there's fun people. But so I guess maybe that is part of what maybe I'm thinking I'm introvert, because I'm like, I can really deeply focus on one person. But at some point I'm like, okay, let's move on. And then at the same time, it's a bit scary to go to new people.
Yes. And I think what you're picking up on is at the moment we're talking about straight introverts versus extroverts. And as soon as you bring the concept of HSP into it actually confuses things a little bit, particularly the HSP extroverts. So if I get you to pause your thoughts there.
Yes.
Because I think it might become a little bit clearer once I bring in the HSP side of it, because that does tend to muddy the waters a little bit, particularly for extroverts.
Okay, so this is why it's not as clear cut. Okay, so I'm gonna totally let you carry on. No, this is great. You telling me this. Yeah. So because obviously this is one layer, introvert, extrovert, which is I guess for the most of the population. There's someone can recognize himself in one of those, but then you have the HSP, which is where we sort of like gonna build that in. Okay, so
exactly,
sorry.
Yeah. And it's the classic confusion that most HSP extroverts go through is your thought process that is happening right now. That's what happens for most HSP extroverts. There's this confusion. We don't really fit here properly, but we don't really fit here properly either. And then as soon as I bring in HSP, most people go, oh, okay, yeah, that makes much more sense.
I mean, that's the story of my life, not fitting. So, okay, so that's a whole other episode. Okay. So energy source within or external.
The other big difference is thinking versus talking, thinking versus speaking. So introverts think before they speak. Just straight extroverts need to talk in order to think, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So extroverts will process things through talking, which is probably why in our last episode we talked for so long, because you were trying to process everything, all this information that was coming at you, and you needed to talk through it. And that's a classic extrovert thing.
Yes. I was just thinking I just did it now as well, just 2 seconds ago. I was like, well, wait, when I'm at a party.
Exactly. That's a classic extrovert, whereas an introvert would actually sit in silence for a while and just kind of process it all internally, and then they would speak their conclusion.
But then I do that a lot too. But I guess that's probably a HSP thing. I've got it. It's more I melt over. Yeah, it's very confusing. Yes.
You can. Yeah, that's why so many people are confused when you just add different bits, and then it just becomes a little bit blurred. But particularly with that side of things, that's probably something that you could ask people in your life. Do I talk a lot? Do I seem to process things out loud? Because other people might notice that, particularly if you have introverts in your life, because they often get a little bit lost when we're talking, because like my fiance does that. He's like, what do you need from me right now? Because I'm not quite sure. You seem to be talking around in circles. And I said, because I'm trying to process it. So I don't need anything from you other than to please just listen and be my sounding board. So that information can sometimes come from people in our lives. They can say, oh yeah, you talk a lot, but it's not as simple as talking a lot versus not talking much. Because if you have two introverts who are deep in conversation, they're going to be talking a lot. So it's not as simple as that. It's kind of what's the process behind the talking. So for extroverts, we're actually trying to process our thoughts through our words. whereas an introvert will process their thoughts silently and then just speak the conclusion.
But it makes sense. I like that you added the variable of it's the process. It's like, how are you processing? Is it out loud or internal? Or where do you find it more natural to process? Would you rather call up a friend to process or just think about it for yourself? Like, where do you feel better? Because even if I'm well over something, sometimes I wish I was like, I had someone on retainer I could just quickly call and just talk it out, but I don't, because I understand boundaries. So
right? A therapist on retainer, right? Or something.
Exactly. Actually, I do have a therapist, but I can't just call her willy-nilly. I mean, that would be, that'd probably be very expensive. But so I do understand boundaries. Even with her, I don't just like email her because I have an issue. So I hold back. But I guess what I'm trying to get to is like, what is your impulse? Is your impulse to wish you had someone you could confide in? Or is it, no, you can just like, you're more comfortable and you find peace by figuring out yourself? And sometimes, like you said, there are variables, right? Sometimes I just need to process it on my own, and that's good. Yep. And sometimes, but yeah, I often sometimes yesterday I had a situation where I was like, oh, I wish I just had a coach or I could just call a therapist like anytime. Because there was something that came up, and I was like, I didn't like the feeling of having to be in my thoughts about it.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I do talk a lot.
And in answer to that, I'm sure that you would have a friend who would offer to be your sounding board in that sense, and that's always helpful, because particularly if you've got a friend who is also an extrovert or a HSP extrovert, then you could almost rely on each other for that aspect, because they would understand what it's like to really need to talk something through and not be able to. So it's not necessarily something you need to pay for, I suppose.
I get but I think it's because I think maybe it's just sometimes because I think the amount of time I feel like I want to call someone, it wouldn't be fair on people for me to do that every time. That's what I'm talking. That's what I mean about boundaries. So I do it. Like I have some go-to. I have like 3-4 go-to people for things that are like things like from yesterday, for example. But I can't do that every time because it'd be abusing their goodwill, and I don't want them to feel like I'm just dumping on them. So I try, and there's many times where I just hold it back, just so we can have a more of a healthy, to have a healthy relationship. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And what you're describing is also a thought process that most HSP extroverts go through as well. So many of my ladies have said exactly that. Like, I don't want to burden people with my processing, whereas I think that is potentially a HSP side coming out, because we are very others focused and worry about our impact on other people. Whereas if you didn't have the HSP side, you'd probably just be calling your friends and processing things.
It could also be the empathy or the empath as well, you know. Like, we understand how it can feel like when people just dump it all without,
exactly.
Like. So that was number 3, thinking versus speaking, and the process behind it.
Yep. And the last big difference between them is the speed of processing information. So introverts process things slower, whereas extroverts process things in the moment. So they're very good at things like debating, anything that's happening in the moment, arguments. An argument for an introvert, having an argument with an extrovert can be very daunting, because the extrovert is just kind of at them wanting a response. Come on, what do you think about that? Whereas the introvert's just going, oh my gosh, I need time to figure out what I think about that. And so that's can often cause a lot of friction in relationships as well. Whereas if we can just take a step back and just respect that the introvert and the extrovert brain are different, and the introvert brain needs time to process things, whereas the extrovert brain is just very much in the moment.
That's interesting. That's interesting, because definitely here, and I guess that's where not to go on another tangent, but like just for this one, I guess this is where probably it's going to make sense when we go into layer it into the HSP. But In this one, in a romantic relationship, I need time to figure it out. I've been very outspoken about that on the podcast before, where I literally say, like, the more that person pushes me. I think my ex was definitely more like extrovert in that thing, because he was like, he kept pushing and pushing. The more he'd push, the more confused and quieter I would go. And the less, like, it was literally almost like I feel mute. I can't think straight. I don't even know what's going on. Like, the more you press, the more, like, it's almost like my memory goes, and I need, like, time to figure out what it is that I'm feeling, what it is I'm actually truly upset about.
Yep.
And knowing how to word it. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, exactly.
For
definitely.
you?
Yep. And that is definitely a HSP thing. So, and that's probably a very good segue into bringing the HSP side into things, because I like to say that HSP extroverts are walking contradictions. And that's because of everything that we've just talked about. So if you think about the example that you just gave, in a relationship, a HSP extrovert, or in any situation, is going to be able to process things quickly, but because we have the depth of processing, quite often we also need time. So we can still do pretty well in a debate, in an argument, but quite often what will happen is, upon reflection, and once we've had time to process, because the D in the DOES criteria, deep processing, that's when exactly what you're saying, you need time to figure out, how do I feel about this? What's really going on for me? Whereas you could respond in the moment if your extrovert brain is switched on. You could respond,
yes,
but it's not necessarily going to be what you want to say, or it's not necessarily well thought out or considered, because you need the time to process it.
Oh my God, you have just been a fly on the wall in every arguments I've had with a boyfriend. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes sense now. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So basically, if you think of a HSP extrovert as essentially having two contradictory sides, because even just then, when I was going through the criteria of an introvert, if you compare that to the DOES criteria, the DOES, there are a lot of similarities. And that's why most HSPs are introverts. So 70%, so I think I did the statistics on the last episode, but I'll do them again. So 15 to 20% of the population are HSPs. Of those 15 to 20%, 70% of them are introverts, which leaves only 30% who are extroverts. And that equates to 6% of the population, or about 1 in 20 people would be a HSP extrovert. So quite unique. But I think part of the reason why is because the two things don't really go together. Being a HSP and being an extrovert is almost like having two different people inside you that have different needs, and sometimes contradictory needs, which is one of the ones that you've just described. Another one is the whole getting energy from our environment. So HSP extroverts, our extrovert side has that craving for sensory stimulation. But then if we go to, let's say, a party and we're meeting all these new people, then our HSP side, the overstimulation is potentially going to come in, and then we're going to just feel overloaded and overwhelmed, and then just go, oh my gosh, I need some time out to process all of this, to just kind of bring myself back to some sort of equilibrium. So it's almost like having this constant seesaw in your personality, where one time the extrovert side might be winning, but then all of a sudden the HSP side kicks in, and it's just this, it's almost a constant battle within us as to who's getting their needs met, the HSP or the extrovert, which is quite challenging, as you can imagine.
Yeah, is that what you just mentioned about, parties, but then the overwhelm because of the way was it because of how we process things?
Yes, and also the nervous system, because we're taking in so much, and our nervous system is overactive, so then it just gets to a point where it's too much.
Is this how, maybe how in everyday life, for example, because I like you already know, like I used to walk around thinking I'm an introvert, right? Because I can, I can totally, I know how to spend time by myself. I don't get bored by myself. But like I do sometimes, I'm realizing, oh, I'm getting a bit miserable. So I'll be like social, and then I get a taste. I'm like, oh yeah, this is really fun. And then I overbook myself, right? I'll be like 4 or 5 socials in a week, and then I realize halfway through, I'm like, oh, I'm knackered now. I can't do this. I need to cancel the rest. And then I cancel the rest. And it's like, is it that thing? Is this where you say like that seesaw? It's like, wow, this is fun. I'm really enjoying. I'm like hanging out with friends, and this is great, and we're having fun and great conversation.
You're feeling energized.
Yeah, I feel, yeah, exactly. I feel younger, it's like, it's great. And then all of a sudden I'm like, oh my God, I need to shut that door. I'm exhausted.
Yep. So that's a classic example of your extrovert side is out and about doing her thing, but then your HSP side goes, nah, hang on, too much. I'm in overload. I've put too much on my plate again. I need to have that downtime and that alone time. And so the alone time that you talk about is what your HSP side needs. But as with a lot of HSP extroverts, it can lead you to think that you're an introvert. So one of the terms that I put out there in my messaging is I call us introverted extroverts, because that kind of sits well with a lot of HSP extroverts who've never heard the term highly sensitive person. And that's why. And it's almost like, the way I like to describe it is, if you imagine introversion and extroversion is on a continuum, with introverts at one end and extroverts at the other end. I feel like what happens with highly sensitive extroverts, it's almost like our HSP side drags us more towards the middle of that continuum. And that's why we feel like we have some introvert traits, which doesn't make sense. Because then they say, well, your brain's different, so you can only be one or the other. So that's why we get confused and we think, well, no, but I feel like an introvert here. But then other people will say, no, you're definitely an extrovert. So, and it's because of those, as I said, it's almost you've got 2 different personas within you that have different needs and different requirements. And that's your HSP side and your extrovert side.
And this is making sense, actually. It is making sense. It's making sense as well while we sort of like misdiagnose ourselves, if we can call it that, a diagnosis. But so, you mentioned the contradiction about, going to parties, but then being over, all of a sudden it's like overstimulated almost, and then we need to close the door. Are there other contradictions as well for HSPEs?
Well, I think the one we mentioned earlier about the processing. So we can process in the moment, but then we also need that downtime, and afterwards we go, as you said, oh, actually, that wasn't really the main issue. This is my main issue, that we actually figure out after we've processed it for a little bit. So it's again, we can do both. So we can process in the moment, but we do really need to give ourselves time, which is more on the introvert side of things, but it's actually our HSP side that needs that time to deeply process, because that's what one of the criteria of HSPs are. So that's another one. I think again, it's like the same scenarios play out, but it's for different reasons. So if you think of the energy from within versus energy from the environment that extroverts need, but same thing with that. We go out because we want energy, we need energy. So that's your extrovert side saying, oh, I feel a bit lonely, or I need some people time. I call it peopling. We need to go out peopling. Mm-hmm. But then we go, oh, yeah, no, now I'm drained, because then our nervous system gets overstimulated, and then we need time out to recover from that peopling that we just did. So an extrovert who isn't a HSP doesn't have that. They could just book their calendar like you say you do. They could book their calendar and they would just leave that calendar. They wouldn't get to a point where they went, oh, no, can't take any more of this. I need some space. I need a break. So even the energy is, again, a bit of a contradiction. So it's kind of trying to fulfill the needs of two sides, which is why I say it's kind of like that seesaw, because if you then spend too much time by yourself in your own company, your extrovert side will start to get a bit sad, will start to get a bit lonely, and will need to go out and get that sensory stimulation that comes from being with people or being out in the environment. So that's when the seesaw kind of swings the other way. But then, of course, that if you do that too much, then it swings the other way. So you just imagine HSP extroverts on this constantly moving seesaw, and it's quite difficult to actually remain in balance just because of those completely contradictory aspects of our personality.
But that's interesting, because I just wrote down 3 words here when I was listening to you here. And it's sort of 3 scenarios. I guess I can understand for people who are extroverts, who are not HSP, why now understand why they don't need to cancel. But that's probably also why they don't understand people cancelling.
Yes,
right.
Definitely.
Right. So you're right. So this brings like a bit more clarity. But it's also, then there's these other 2 things, which is like, living with people. So I'm just thinking like, maybe we're going to go into like how we manage this, because I was just thinking, how do HSPEs, like extroverts, how do they manage having kids then? Because in my mind, because I live by myself and I'm enjoying the quiet, I actually really love it. But like sometimes I do like, it'd be nice to have like a big warm family, or to have, even just actually to think about a partner, right? So sometimes I'm like, it's like, how do you manage that side? Because I feel like this is what I came up with years ago. I was like, for me, the ideal, right? If I was to live with another person, or if I was to live with another person and we have children, is that everybody needs to have their own little cave room where they can go in and no one's allowed to enter. So that this is typical HSP, right? I think that from what I can understand. For me, it's like, because I like to be able to, because one of my favorite things when I was traveling in Australia, actually, in your country, is that when I was in this, what we call backpacker, right, youth hostel, is that it was so nice that there was people around all the time, and I made friends, and I would live with my friends and party with my friends. Some of them would go to same workplace, right, the same restaurant. I mean, it was fantastic, great community. But then in the morning, there was like 10 people saying good morning before I even had my coffee, and that would drive me crazy. But at the same time, I was just like, as much as like internally I was like, don't talk to me, people knew as well at some point that like in the morning just I'm not functional, and then but at the same time I was just like, this is such an amazing luxury, that the fact that even in the moment I knew that the fact that I can say, oh, for fuck's sake, can I close the door? In my mind, I wouldn't say it out loud, because again, because I understand consideration to people. But in my mind, I was like, oh, for fuck's sake, can I just take a shower without 5 people in the same, like, not in the same shower, but like it's those things where there's 10 people in that same room and there's like 10 showers, cabins, right? And it's like, it's too much. But I knew it was a luxury, because I do love the community feel of people I enjoy, like people I like. But I need that. Sometimes it gets too intense where I just need to sit down and be quiet and no one comes and disturbs me.
Yep. And I think you hit the nail on the head with your everybody has their own little cave. I think that would work really well.
I need to make a lot more money to afford that big house.
But it could even be as simple as, like, if you have a family, then the only people that don't really have their own separate space is potentially you and your partner. But you could actually create a space in the house that could be, or the rule could be, like, if I'm in the bedroom with the door closed, you just don't disturb me, kind of thing. But in terms of managing it, I take my hat off to any HSP, introvert or extrovert, who has children, because I just think it is such a big stressor for them. Like, it's stressful for people who aren't HSPs, but I think knowing that HSPs need that downtime, get overstimulated easily,
and children
don't understand that. They're
just
that's just life and for them. And so I think the only way to the best thing that any of us can do for ourselves, I believe, is just truly understand who we are and what we need and what makes us tick. And I think if you get to that point, and that's why I'm part of the reason I'm out here doing this work, is because I think HSP extroverts in particular need to understand who they are and what they need because of the contradictory needs. And I think once you get to that point, then it's about asking for what you need and respecting what you need. And I think if you have unique needs like HSP extroverts do, then that automatically helps you respect other people's needs as well. So it's about setting up your life so that you can respect your needs and the needs of other people in your life, which I think should probably be a given anyway, but it's not necessarily, and it's not necessarily a conscious thing. Whereas I think if you can make it a little bit more of a conscious process, like your idea of the cave, I mean, you could make that happen. You might not have a big cave for each person, but you could have a little piece of the house or a little space that kind of you set up as your sanctuary. It could be like a beautiful armchair in the window.
Yeah, I mean, the man traditionally have the garage or the basement, right?
Yeah.
So why can't
exactly.
I could have the penthouse. Yeah. No, I would actually want my own room. Like, that's how I feel, because I feel like if I'm just in the bedroom, I feel weird that, no, you can't come in. I would respect if it was him. Yeah, but I would respect that if he needed his space to have the bedroom. But I think for me, it's not so much a fact just closing the door. I need to know that I need to know that I'm not actually pushing someone out. It's just weird. It's this really weird. It's
and
like
that in itself is a HSP thing. That is a very HSP thing, to be so cognizant of what somebody else's needs are, and the fact that by me coming into this space and closing the door and no one else can come in, I'm actually pushing somebody else out. So that's a very HSP thing to worry about. And one of my clients has actually done exactly what you're talking about.
The caves?
Well, not the cave, but she's got her own room. So they've moved
into
this house with a lot of bedrooms, and she's got her own space. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a separate bedroom. Obviously, it could just be like a study type area where you just set it up how you want. Like, she's got her crystals everywhere. She's got a gorgeous armchair that she just loves to sit in and read.
My candles.
It just needs to be a space. Yeah, exactly.
My candles, the nice smellies, the candles, everything. Yeah, I just need to have my own girly room, like my own sanctuary with all my stuff.
Yeah. And I think that's there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's part of just going, hey, this is me. Like, if this is going to work, us cohabitating or us having a family, then this is what I need. And I don't think there's anything wrong with asking for that, because everybody wins in those situations when we're all respecting our own unique needs and boundaries. Then that's where harmony comes in. It's when those needs are not being met that you have issues.
Like, what would be the main point that a HSPE would need to have set up in terms of how to manage their traits, whether living alone or with other people? But what are the things that you say, okay, if you're a HSPE and you recognize yourself in that, here are the here are the 5 areas that you need to be aware of, and here are the steps that you can start thinking about or take in order to manage, so you don't get overwhelmed or don't get these crazy lows. And because I know we mentioned last time about the high could be higher but the lows are lower, so you can kind of be a bit with tendency for depression and that kind of stuff. So what are the things, the areas to be aware of, and what should we put in place really to sort of manage this kind of, really, like you said, walking contradiction? Because I can understand how people may think, people who are on this, and may think this is fucking crazy. And I know, and I even one I'm like, gosh, yeah, but it kind of sort of makes sense, and it kind of almost makes sense when you see different types of parenting. People say, be quiet, shush, stop, turn the music down. It's not because they want you to be smaller or lesser. It's just because they can't take it. It's overstimulating for them. And they kind of, like, those are things that I wish I was been brought into awareness, even in schools, to say, if your parents are saying this, it's not about you. It's just because they're more sensitive to that. And Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. So, well, before we go into the challenges, did you want me to talk about ambiverts, or
Oh,
do you
yes. Sorry.
leave
Yes.
that for?
Yeah. I
Okay,
mean,
that's a short bit, the
oh,
ambiverts.
perfect. Yeah, go ahead.
So, in a nutshell, my belief, and this is because I haven't seen any science that contradicts it, is that ambiverts don't exist. So, ambiverts technically can be introverts or extroverts. Like they like to say, like it's almost like they've got one foot either side of the line in the middle of the continuum. But I think it's come about because there's a lot of stigma and there's a lot of misunderstanding around introverts and extroverts. So some people don't want to be either, or they're proud to say, oh, well, I'm both. But I don't think they exist for a couple of reasons. One, because if you look at the brain science, there's differences between an introvert brain and an extrovert brain. And if you think about the continuum, what I think's happening when people think they're ambiverts is a couple of different things. One is they might be a HSP extrovert, and I think that's the answer for a lot of them because they are HSP, as we've just described. HSP traits are much similar to introverts than they are to extroverts. So I think that's one explanation, is that they might be a HSP extrovert, and that's why they think they're an ambivert, because they've never heard of HSPs. The other thing that might be happening is they are very close to the middle of the continuum, but they're still going to have a default position. And I think that's the thing to remember, is we are born this way, introvert or extrovert. So we have a default where we feel comfortable. And what can often happen in life, particularly in this day and age, Western society, the Western world is very extrovert focused, and extroverts tend to be rewarded more the traits of extroversion than introverts. So in order to get ahead in the world, what happens is many introverts start to do things that would be more comfortable, or more, you would think that's a more extrovert thing to do. And you can, as an extrovert, you can introvert, and as an introvert, you can extrovert, but it doesn't mean that you're jumping the line and becoming that other trait.
Right, there's like there's learned behavior and then innate behavior, right? Like, or traits, innate traits and learned behavior.
Yeah, so that's exactly what I'm talking about here. So for example, you might see, my business coach is a classic example of this. We were talking about the other day. She's so introverted that she's bordering on, she calls herself a hermit. She'd be quite happy to never see anybody and never really do anything except hang out on her property with her horses, and she's like a rescue. She's got all these rescue animals.
Aww.
But yeah. I
love horses.
And she's got she's been out there on big stages in the world, giving speeches to thousands of people, and some people looking at her would say, "Oh, no, you must be an extrovert." But what you'll find is there are a lot of famous people out there. There are a lot of public speakers out there who are introverts. And what's going on for them is that they're stepping out of their comfort zone. And I saw this quote recently, which I think captures it perfectly. An introvert can get up on the stage and speak, and in fact, they'd rather do that than mill around and talk with the hundreds of people in the audience at the end of their speech. So that's an example of where people are potentially doing things that make them appear they're an extrovert, but actually they're just learned behaviors, and that doesn't change who you are though. So that's the difference. Understanding and accepting yourself and recognizing what your needs are and fulfilling those needs. So when we go back to the public speaking example, like if an introvert does a speech on the stage, it's likely to be draining for them. Whereas if an extrovert does it, it's likely to boost them and give them energy because they're feeding off the energy of the crowd. So the introvert is likely to go, and I remember my dad telling me a story. I can't remember who it was, but he said he was It was somebody who does a lot of public speaking, and he was saying how at the end of it must have been in his autobiography or something, at the end of his speech, he used to have to go and hide out in the bathroom just to get away from the people and just to kind of recenter, get back to himself and recharge, because that was so draining for him as an introvert, whereas an extrovert would be feeding off the energy. And that's what used to happen to me. I used to deliver training courses. I was a facilitator of different training, and I used to, if the energy was in the room was good and they were bouncing off me and they're asking questions and they're engaged, that would actually give me more energy. Whereas if they were all silent, then I'd have to obviously give the energy myself. But that's an example. So I think when we try and label other people, we don't know what's happening in their internal space. So just because somebody's out there doing extrovert things, it doesn't mean they are an extrovert. And I think it's those people who are potentially saying, oh, I'm an ambivert, whereas my argument is, no, you haven't changed who you are. You've just learned some behaviors and learned some skills that kind of put you in the other category temporarily. But then your default is still you're an introvert or you're an extrovert.
And so this is great. I mean, that's I love how you explain that. It makes it. This is you bringing clarity to this. I really love that. And you know, with that also explains. So let's say someone's on stage and they're like an extrovert, so they gain energy from that. They love it, you know, especially if they're, you know, given that the audience is bouncing back positively off them. And so let's say afterwards, their internal preferences would be to go carrying on this and be social and go to the bar and talk to people. But definitely. The HSP side, I was wondering if this is something that's a HSP thing, but the HSP side is going, oh, but you know, what if maybe they don't want to talk to me, maybe I don't know, I'm not gonna know what to say to them, maybe we're not going to flow in conversation, you know, you start to have to hesitate. Is that the HSP going, like, you know, you start to go a bit more inwards and that depth of processing, and maybe being a bit too sensitive to a very noisy bar, and what if we don't get on, and you know, all this questioning,
particularly if you've already done a speech. So if you've done a speech that depending on the environment, depending on what else is going on, it might invigorate a HSP extrovert, but they're not necessarily going to be able to continue on. They might for a bit, and I've had that experience where I've been to this, I wasn't the speaker, but I went to like this big event and there was a lot of energy in the crowd and I was with people that I really liked, and it was like a full day thing, and then everybody goes for a drink afterwards. And then I'd want to do that because I'm all caught up in the energy. But then when I get to the bar and I stand there and I start having a drink, I go, oh, you know what? I'm absolutely shattered now. I really just need to go home and shut the door on the world and recover from that. So it's kind of, and then again, that's the contradictory nature coming out. And it's just about respecting where we are at, and recognizing that there's nothing wrong with it. Like there's nothing wrong with introverts, there's nothing wrong with extroverts, there's nothing wrong with HSPs. It's just about recognizing and respecting our differences and not making them bad or wrong.
Yeah, and I think like before we move on to the, you know, what to set up in place and how to manage, I kind of just wanted to say something about with the ambivert. I want to see if I'm understanding you correctly. So with ambiverts, you know, and like, you know, learned behaviors is what lies behind the facade. So we may be good at combating our shyness or whatever it is, but actually it does not mean that we're not shy, for example, right? So I know we didn't mention shy and this whole thing, but that's kind of like what I came up with. But so it's like so when someone says so maybe like what you're saying is that ambivert may not really be a thing. It's just that it feels that way because you've learned how to overcome certain traits. But however, this may not be your innate nature.
Yes, that's exactly it. Yeah, and so that's where the danger comes on putting other people in boxes, because we don't know what their default place is. We don't know what's below the surface and what's actually driving them. And it could be that this speech they're giving is going to just drain them of so much energy that they're going to need a whole day to recover. And we're assuming that they're an extrovert. So it's just about not putting people in boxes unless they've kind of allowing them to tell you what they are, I suppose, is where it's always going to be better than trying to decide what other people are, because that's where a lot of the misconceptions and misunderstandings come from as well. Is like, one of them is one you just mentioned, all introverts are shy. That shyness is like a completely different concept that has nothing to do with introverts. So you can have a shy extrovert, and but that's the label that has been put on introverts. Introverts are quiet. It's another label that's been put on them just through observations. Whereas if some introverts, when you really get to know them, and if it's in a small environment, that small group, and they feel really comfortable, they could be the life of the party and be cracking jokes and all sorts. So it's, I think that's where we kind of go wrong, is we meet a couple of introverts and we go, oh, well, they're really quiet and they're really shy, so therefore all introverts must be quiet and shy. And that's,
even I thought that, even though I've been listening to you this whole time, I'm still in my mind, I'm like, yeah, introvert, shy. So yeah, there's a lot of work to be done out here. Yeah, I mean, or maybe I'm the only one who's like super dense, but it's just like,
it's quite common. It's very common.
Because it is, but you're right. Like if you were in a circle and you're comfortable, certainly people, like, they come out of their shells. And the same with, and I guess extroverts, they're not necessarily always the loud ones, right?
No, exactly. Yeah, because that's another misunderstanding, that extroverts are loud. And the ones that the derogatory ones I've heard, and these are comments that have been made on my quiz that I've got out there for people to try. Extroverts have been called loud, obnoxious, arrogant. Introverts were called losers. And it's just, there's no need for those derogatory terms. We're just different from each other. So
because you mentioned extrovert can be shy.
Yeah.
Can you just explain that to me? Because I mean, I get it, because I can be shy.
Yeah. Because shyness it's the only way I can explain it is shyness is a different characteristic, and it may even be a characteristic as opposed to a trait. I'm pretty sure it is. I think it's like a nature versus nurture type thing. So you're either born an introvert or an extrovert. That's an innate trait.
Yeah.
Whereas, and I haven't looked into shyness completely, but my understanding is that shyness is more a characteristic. So anybody could be shy because it's a characteristic of a person, as opposed to it goes with the trait of introversion.
So what do you mean by, when you say characteristic, you mean it's learned? Or is you born with it?
So trait is born and characteristic is learned. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So it could be through circumstances. So I remember like one of my clients was saying that because she had quite an overbearing mother, she was kind of always told to be seen and not heard. And every time she spoke up, like there were things that were in her environment that caused her to end up shy. And she became like afraid of strangers and not wanting to meet new people. So it was kind of something that she became, as opposed to she was born that way. And so with characteristics like that versus traits, anybody can have them, and they're unrelated to the trait, if that makes sense.
Yes, yeah. Okay, no, that's great. That's I just was trying to understand whether it was like nature or nurture, right? Born or learned. And so would this be like a good way to segue into what are the areas that HSPEs need to be aware of and that they need to manage, and what are the steps they need to think about?
Yep, sure. So I'll go through these relatively briefly, because each one of them I could probably do a whole training on.
I'm
so
sure.
I'll just go through it briefly. But these are not necessarily all of the challenges of HSP extroverts, but they're the ones that I've seen in pretty much all my clients and all the ladies that I've spoken to. So the first one is overthinking, and some of these will be relevant to HSP introverts as well, but not all of them. So overthinking, getting stuck in your head, overanalyzing, or ruminating as they call it. And one of the things that I like to say to my clients is there's a difference between overthinking and ruminating. because overthinking is something that a HSP is going to do because they process everything quite deeply. So they're going to spend a lot of time thinking about stuff and processing stuff. But what I try and teach my clients is to recognize when it has kind of tipped over the edge into ruminating, which the difference being ruminating is unhelpful repetition, and there's worry or anxiety or some other unhelpful emotions associated with that. So for an example, let's say that you're out with a couple of girlfriends and you say something and then nothing kind of gets made of it, but then afterwards a HSP will be going, oh, that's right, I said that. Oh, I hope they didn't think I meant that. Oh, God, I feel awful. Like, I really hope she didn't think that I meant that because I didn't. And then that's the processing that's happening. And then you go, oh, and then you think about what was the other one's reaction. Did they say anything? Did they seem a bit quiet afterwards? So you're doing all this processing. Where it would then turn into ruminating is if that then starts to kind of overtake your life and you can't kind of really do anything else because, or you try and go and do, you might try and go off to work, and then every spare moment you're like, oh my God, that's right, I said that, oh God. And then it just becomes almost on this repetitive loop that you just can't get it out of your head. So that's the difference between just normal overthinking and processing and ruminating. And the easiest way to pull yourself out of ruminating, so overthinking, I think, it's really powerful to just allow yourself and accept that you are going to process things deeply and you are going to spend a lot of time thinking. So I wouldn't suggest you try and change that because that's part of your trait. But when it comes to ruminating, the best thing you can do, the best solution for ruminating is taking action. So when you feel like you're stuck and you're going round and round in circles, like that example I just gave, the best thing you could do is call or text your friend and say, hey, guess what? I said this the other night. It might be nothing, but I've been thinking and I'm concerned that you might think it's this. Can we talk or can we clarify? And chances are they'll probably write back and go, oh, I can't even remember you saying that. Oh, don't worry about it. No, it's fine. But just taking that action has what hits the ruminating on the head and helps you stop it because you've actually taken some action. So that's the best thing to do to overcome that challenge. The second one is taking things personally. So this is due to our depth of processing and our sensitivity to subtleties because we pick up things that others don't. Now, interestingly, it's human nature to take things personally because human beings are quite egocentric. But because of our sensitivity, it can be a little more hurtful or a little more damaging when we do take things personally. And I think I've actually got a training course. It's just a mini training course that I've set up on tools to stop taking things personally because this is one of the main challenges. So that's one thing you could do to overcome is just sign up for my course. But in a nutshell, the best thing to do in those situations is to recognize that most things people say to you are not about you. It's a reflection of what's going on for them. And so if you imagine that we as humans, we make meaning out of things. We attribute meaning to things that people say, things that people do. When you've taken something personally, the easiest, well, not easiest because it's not necessarily easy to do, but it does come with practice. But try and think of a different meaning that you could have put on that behavior or you could have put on those words. And you can even turn it into a bit of a game. So you come up with stupid examples of what they could have meant or what different way you could have interpreted it, because what that does is it kind of shows you, oh, there's literally thousands of different interpretations that I could have had of that comment or of that eye roll or whatever it is that we've taken personally. And we remind ourselves that it's not necessarily about us.
But this is also why I think I really believe maybe that's why I got into a lot of, sort of like really believing in inner work and really introspection and self-awareness to not have those thoughts and those reactions, because I think because it is so important, because I'm at this place now in my life and I'm really grateful for it, that really I can really make a separation between, I may feel it may sting, but I also do know it has got nothing to do with me. It's just, there's nothing, you don't need to react, don't have to engage. I don't feel the need to go into this whole whirlwind anymore, because I think it's really important to separate and to just, it takes time and it takes work, and I still have a lot of work to do, like I think all of us. So it's like work in progress, right? But it's really letting go of the drama, letting go of the struggle, and not, I think, because we have to be really careful not to go into like neurotic behavior, which is not something that's necessarily a HSP thing. I think we see it around a lot of people, right? Especially online, you know, a lot of things completely out of control, cyberbullying, and you name it. And I think this is probably a good place. I just quickly just say, we mentioned this last week, but it's like, you know, HSP, just because we are sensitive, we are not, HSP is not the equivalent of what you know, and you mentioned this, hypersensitivity, right? We are not, is it histrionics, you know? So for example, you know, we're not, you made that great example last week. And I just want to say it again here, just in case it got cut off of the edit, because I haven't edited it yet. But, you know, you mentioned this great example of, you may have like a couple of words with a colleague, or something happens with a colleague, and the next day you come back to work and you're like, oh, can we just, you know, just have a quick chat, just like talk it out, you know, just, you know. And in the meantime, you realize that person has got around and talked about you to the whole office, and then went to HR and filed an actual complaint, right? And that's this overreaction. This is not something that HSP do, because I think HSP, or they may do, but it's not really a trait, because that other reaction where suddenly they go to management and file a complaint or expose you online and all this kind of crap, is that those are people who lack empathy. Because when you have empathy, true empathy is to also make space for people who are different to you, think different to you, have different opinions to you. We don't necessarily go into the attack, right? We have that space, we have that sensitivity, which allows us not to be histrionics and hysteric and hypersensitive, right? So I just wanted to make that clear, because I think I don't want, like you said, HSPs can get a bad name, and that is not what an empathic person would do at all. You know, escalate something like that like crazy for no reason.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and you're right. It's a difference between hypersensitivity and high sensitivity. And examples like that are people who have never learned to manage their emotions effectively. And that's where the issue is. And you can have HSPs who are like that and not necessarily go on the attack, but have the big kind of hissy fit, or the big kind of public breakdown in the office where they're crying or they're yelling or whatever the response is. But what I say is, the way I kind of explain it is that everybody can be like that. And as you say, it's not part of the HSP trait. HSPs can be like that if they haven't done the work. And it's the same with everybody. If you haven't done the work and you haven't learned to manage yourself effectively, then you can end up being a hypersensitive person and having those sorts of behaviours. And that's why it is important to do the work, to learn. If you weren't taught throughout your childhood, if you were unlucky and didn't have a stable, helpful, happy parents, then it may be that you weren't taught how to manage your emotions. And as you said, the importance of self-work is huge. And just on that, I think, in my observation, because the research has shown that HSPs who have a less than ideal childhood are more damaged than non-HSPs with the exact same childhood. And so what that means is that you do have a lot of HSPs growing up with challenges from their childhood. But on the plus side, HSPs also have this thing called vantage sensitivity, where we respond better and faster to positive interventions than a non-HSP would. So
that's what we learn very fast in therapy?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, leaps and bounds. It is so different than a non-HSP. So so in some ways it's two sides of that coin that we talked about last time. So on the one hand, you might come into adulthood with more baggage than somebody who isn't a HSP. But on the flip side of that, it's easier for you to get rid of that baggage than a non-HSP, because of the vantage sensitivity.
You really have a chance to get better even faster than you'd think. That's a great plus, and that's good. And I think it's like in anything, and I think that's definitely the message here, is that accountability for ourselves and responsibility for ourselves is so, we have to be responsible and accountable for our behavior and our inner world, because it's gonna be portrayed outside, right? So we have to really be accountable, and I think the first step is awareness and like finding out, like even I'm learning here today with you about some traits about me, right?
Good.
But that's important because it's going to help me be more accountable to myself, so that it's easier in relationships with other people, right? Because it's not on them. It's not even with ex-boyfriends. It's not on them that I can't, that I don't know how to express myself in the heat of the moment or whatever. It's not on them. And
I think that's such a good way of looking at inner work, is that it is about taking responsibility and accountability for us and our behaviour and our impact on others and our impact in the world. And people who, because I know people who are they just scoff at the idea that they need to change or that they could get better. And I just feel sorry for people like that, because they're just doomed to repeat the same mistakes over and over again for their entire life, because they're so anti inner work. And it's just, I think it's really sad.
Yeah, because there is a difference between accept me for who I am, but then also just going brazen boldly in and go accept me for who I am, including all of my craziness and my quirks that I refuse, that are not a bad behavior, but I refuse to work on it. That's the entitlement of some people sometimes, right?
Exactly.
So so you said overthinking and taking things personally.
Yep, so there's a couple more. Well, just on that about the inner work as well. One thing that I have found that seems to be quite across the board with HSPs is self-worth. So I think a lot of HSPs have some self-worth work to do, because even if we had stable, lovely childhoods, I was blessed with an amazing set of parents and so lucky compared to a lot of HSPs. But I still had some self-worth stuff that I had to overcome. And I think it comes from growing up, knowing we're different, thinking that there's something wrong with us, trying to bend and mold and change ourselves to fit in, and then it going wrong. And then we just end up with, a bit of self-worth stuff that I think needs to be cleared in a lot of people. So that's quite a common thing. And that's something that is difficult to do on your own. So I would highly recommend a coach or a psychologist to help you with that.
Is it because of that constant contradiction we're walking around with? That sort of like, then we have to fit in because...
I think it's more because even HSP introverts have this issue. I think it's more, and Dr. Elaine Aron mentions this in I'm reading her psychotherapy book, and she says that the challenges come because we are a minority group. So every person who grows up as a minority has challenges that go with being a minority. And she thinks that that's really, and I like that thought, because it kind of, again, it's like there's not anything wrong with us. It's just that people don't understand us. And so it's us trying to fit in that can cause a lot of the challenges that we have.
Oh, yeah, because we are chipping away our own self, right?
Yes.
It is, because when you try to fit in because people don't understand, it is really hard, because it's that inner conflict, and we feel like we've removed part of ourselves, and that's never a feeling. We're not wholesome. It's almost like it doesn't feel whole anymore, and that's when I think probably that's how depression and things like that can really fit in quite nicely as a companion, right? Because it's like, well, I'm not myself, I don't know what the world is, and
we don't feel good enough as we are. So that's why we try and change, and we try and do different things, as you say, chip away at ourselves. So then we end up sometimes not even recognizing ourselves, and then as a result of that, there's self-worth that goes with that, because thinking you're not good enough, that's self-worth right there. And so because we're different, that then leads to thinking we're not good enough, and therefore work needs to be done to overcome that. And that's part of my passion, is I'm trying to teach HSP extrovert women not dim their light, to stop dimming their light, to stop making themselves different or smaller or quieter, but actually own who they are, because I think they're just beautifully unique, amazing human beings who, once they get past that self-worth stuff, literally flourish before your eyes and blossom, and just have so much to offer the world that that's what makes me happy, is just see women overcome those self-worth issues to become the beautiful human being that they were always meant to be.
Yeah, well, thank you. Right back at you. No, but this is I wish we need to teach that in schools. And there was there a fourth?
There's a couple more. Yes, sorry. There's
this is great. I'm enjoying this. This is good.
I'll go through these quickly, if I can.
So take all the time you need.
Okay, cool. So the other thing that's HSP extroverts, I don't think HSP introverts would probably have this issue, because I think this comes from you pretty much described it before. We do too much. We have a tendency to overload our plate. And as you said, you get halfway through the week and go, oh my gosh, I can't cope with anymore. I need to cancel all these social engagements that I've booked in. So it's not just social stuff. It could be we decide that we're going to start meditating every day, plus go to the gym 3 times a week, and we're going to catch up with our friends on a more regular basis.
And do a fresh juice in the morning.
Every morning, yes.
And then we're going to do a new website, and then we're going to launch a course. Oh, yeah, it's all happening this week.
Yeah, exactly. And we all do that. So HSP extroverts, every single one that I've met does that. And so and I think it comes from a beautiful place. It's due to our excitement about life. It's due to our giving nature, because a lot of it sometimes involves helping other people or charities or whatever. And we have a big appetite for learning. But I think we just need to manage ourselves better in that. And the way to do it is to actually start looking for your signs, recognizing your own signs of when you're getting to that state of overwhelm, because there are like preemptive signs and symptoms that you will see within yourself. And that's when if the earlier you catch it, then you can actually start to do something about it without disappointing too many people by cancelling on them or pulling out of a course that you've just signed up for or whatever it might be. It's just kind of something to just be aware of and constantly try and manage. And every time you do hit that point of overwhelm where you go, oh my gosh, I've done it again, then have a look back and try and focus on, okay, what were the symptoms that I was feeling within myself that I ignored? Because once you're aware you do it, it's easier to then start to overcome it, obviously.
Yeah, and I guess it's a cycle that's important to be aware of, because when you keep doing it, at some point you hit burnout, because you and not only just burnout, but also you just go, well, I can't. It's almost like proving to yourself that you can't do the stuff you set yourself to do, right? Like you can't reach the goals that you want. And effectively, most people can't do all of this stuff. I mean, I'm sure Tony Robbins can, because he's up at 5 a.m. into a cold bath. I mean, that's not how I jam. I just can't do that.
He's not a HSP, I'm sure, either.
Yeah, I mean, he's not. He's got something else, but he's not just human. That guy, is too much for me. I'm like, I'm overwhelmed listening to him. It's too much. He does too much. So it's just, but I think. Yeah, it's because it's almost like, but if you set yourself smaller tasks or just like fewer, now I've realized if I just if I can achieve 2 big things work-wise in my day, that's good enough. That's fine.
Yeah.
Because it always takes longer than we think.
Definitely.
Instead of having 5 things in, website, marketing, it just is too much. It's crazy. So, and then we don't feel like such losers.
Exactly, because you're right, that's what happens if we don't. Because the other thing about HSPs is we have quite high expectations of ourselves as well as of other people, and so when we don't meet our own expectations, we feel like a failure, which then feeds into the self-worth, the self-doubt and all that sort of stuff. So you're better off actually setting a smaller goal and reaching it. And I know that this goes against all the goal setting stuff they say, because they say, oh, you should set one that's so high that if you don't hit it, you'll still be higher than if you set a lower one. I don't subscribe to that theory at all. I just think you're better off being realistic about what you can manage in a day and feeling good about what you've done, rather than trying to set yourself 5 things and only doing 2 of them, and then you end up feeling crap. You end up feeling like you've achieved nothing that day. Whereas if you set 2 and do 2, it's all about managing expectations, I think, when it comes to this one. And if we recognize that we have this tendency to put too much on our plate, that's when we can start going, okay, well, what can I take off before I hit that point of burnout or overwhelm?
Yeah, it's like building a muscle as well, right? Sometimes at the beginning, you can only do 1 or 2 of those things a day, and all of a sudden, a few months down the line, those you don't even need to think about it. It's like it's on autopilot, and then you can add other stuff to it. You can add another couple of things, but it's allowing yourself to build it instead of like putting everything at once, doing everything at once, going trying to lift that 100 kg at the gym. It's not going to happen on day 1. You're going to be lifting 5 kg first, exactly. And that's just what it is. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because that's where because I've got another mini course, goal setting and productivity. Well, it's actually called Get Your Shizzle Together and Rock Your Life. But it's essentially goal setting and productivity, and it's from working with your brain rather than against your brain. So, because I think a lot of the times we do set ourselves up for failure. And as you were talking about, once you turn something into a habit, so particularly things like the fresh juice every day, go to the gym 3 times a week, all those things, and meditate every day, you try and take all of them on at once, it's not going to work. Whereas if you take one of them on and then you turn that into a habit, then you're ready to take on the next one. So that's definitely, there's ways to do it with your brain as opposed to fighting against your brain.
Yeah.
Cool. So the other one we've kind of covered. I talked about self-worth, and I've mentioned vantage sensitivity. So there's only one more big challenge, and I kind of mentioned it briefly earlier, but that's that and this is specifically for HSP extroverts. It's that balancing our need for external stimulation, but then becoming overstimulated. So it's that seesaw that we talked about before. So it's just the way to overcome it, because it is our 2 sides battling. So it's our extrovert nature versus our HSP side. And it's just recognizing that they are competing and they are contradictory, and that we do need to make space for both of them, because I don't think we're ever going to be able to have that seesaw dead in the middle, dead balanced for any length of time. I think it is going to be a bit of a seesaw our whole life. But what we can do is reduce the amount of the swing that happens, so that we actually get better at going, okay, I'm doing a bit too much. I need to back off and maybe build into a bit more self-care activity, a bit more alone time to give my HSP side some downtime, but then recognizing that my extrovert still needs to come out and do stuff as well. So I think that's the best way to manage it, is the awareness comes first, and then just recognizing that you do have these unique challenges, and that's okay. It doesn't mean you're less than anyone else. It just means that you need a unique way of approaching life so that you can balance both of those sides of yourself.
Yeah, and I think I don't know, let me know if this is pertinent to it or not, but because at the moment I'm in therapy, I do CBT, and I'm really loving it. And one of the things that she had me do, one of the first homework I had to do actually, was to balance, because she said I'm too much into production. I'm always focusing on work, blah blah blah, doing and then this is why I'm feeling the way I'm feeling. It's a contributor, right? Contributor. And she said I had to literally at the beginning. Now I don't do it every week, but there was it's like the 3 pillars. What is the things that I absolutely need to do? Like pay bills and admin, whatever. The things that you can't really get away with not doing. You have to do, and then there was another one. I think it was like forward focus, like things like to help me reach my goal. And then the other thing was like pure that's not the word she used, but like pure pleasure, like things whether it's like reading a book or meeting a friend and stuff like that. And now I've sort of now I actually keep a list of what makes me feel rejuvenated. So for example, you actually were part of it. Like last week when we called our first episode, I was so rejuvenated the whole day.
Oh, cool.
And so that came down in the list, yeah. And like next door, we celebrated the 1-year-old birthday of their baby. Well, I guess he's a toddler now. And I was with their families. I felt really great. And I'm starting like keeping a list, right? Mm-hmm. And so that I know now, when I'm starting to feel a certain way, I need to add those things that rejuvenates me. And it's almost sometimes those little simple things is being aware. I have to start being aware of what is that rejuvenates me and what doesn't. And what are the things that, that's what makes me feel aligned. Whether it's, for example, even with the podcast, I talked to her about the podcast as well. And I say, this is what I'm really enjoying. It has those few components in it. And that's when I know it's right. That's why I'm feeling the way I'm feeling. It's because it actually hits all these different points, and it's almost finding out for ourselves, or with the help of someone else, like a coach like yourself or a therapist, is that what are the things that are giving you positive feedback inside? Not validation out for myself, but makes you feel good. And what are the things that you have to do, you can't get away with, even if you don't like doing them, like for me, it's like inbox management. Oh, for God's sake, I hate looking at emails now, but it's, and then paying bills. I got to pay my bills. I got to do my tax return. There's no I don't want to go to jail or get the bailiffs at the door, right? So things like that, you have to have a balance of everything. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think that what you hit on there is really important, because I think as we get older, we often forget, and there's whole different terms for it. Some people call it self-care, pleasure, joy, play. Like, I think as we get older, we forget about playtime. And so what I often do, and it's exactly what you're talking about, is I get my clients to write a playlist, which is the same as your list. So what are the things that give me joy? What are the things that make me feel good? And incorporate those into our day. I think it's almost like we become an adult, and we then feel, and I don't know if non-HSPs have this sense, but it's almost like we feel guilty about doing stuff just for sheer pleasure. We feel like, we could be doing something more productive, or we could be helping out our friend move house, or we could be doing whatever. And we have this sense of guilt around pleasurable activities. But that's what adds joy to our life. So why wouldn't you do more of that? And I think it is just making that bit of a mind shift and recognizing that if you don't put these activities in your life, what's the point, really? I mean, what's the point of living if you don't have activities in there that are just for you to have fun, to bring joy, to make you laugh, to whatever it is, those feel-good moments.
Yeah.
Really, that's what life's all about, and yet we resist putting them into our day.
Yes. Were there other places of awareness and to manage as HSPs?
They're the main ones. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just with that pleasure list or playlist, whatever you want to call it, just a tip. When you get stuck, when you're making this list, one of the best places to go is back to your childhood and work out what you think about the things that you used to do just for fun. And you can add some of those things to your list. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then the trick is then actually doing them, then actually incorporating fun play activities, catch-ups with friends, whatever, making them a priority in your life, as well as paying bills and all the essential activities.
Can I just say, the all these different steps that we just talked about, like overthinking, self-worth and so on, those are for HSP-Es, but some of them also applies for HSP-Is, introverts.
Yes, correct.
Yes, okay. Okay, well, thank you so much, Jen. This was like so much information. I'm really, really enjoying it. I've learned today about myself and other people. Because I sort of think about people in my life as well. I'm like, oh, right, this is why. This has been really wonderful. And I just wanted to do a little recap for our listeners. And so the sort of we went over, the difference between introvert and extrovert. And there were 4 key points in that. And 1 is the focus. 2 is where we get our energy sources from. 3 is we think, is thinking versus speaking. How are we processing out loud? Do we need to talk it out, or do we need to think before we think before we speak? And then the 4th one was speed of processing information, right? So do we need time to figure it out, or are we in the moment? Are we good at, debating arguments? And that's just a pure introvert extrovert. And on top of that came in the complexity of HSPs, right? Because some of us may have some traits from the focus could be extrovert. Some of the speed of processing could be more like an introvert because we're HSP. So this is where the confusion comes in and why maybe ambivert does not actually really exist. And so when we talk about HSP extroverts, there were things like, let's say if you're arguing with someone, you may not actually be good at just being there in the moment, explaining what was wrong in the same way you would like if you were in a debate, a proper debate, because you have that depth of processing. So you may need time to figure it out, even though you're an extrovert, but because you're HSP, you have that depth of processing. The other point was like, if you go to parties, you actually really enjoy, you have that, it gives you that energy and that happiness of being around the people that you like. But then you may actually, you still need to go home and sort of like, because it can be a lot, especially if you go to a lot. You may overbook yourself, right? You may overbook four social events in a week, and all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, I need to cancel half of them because it's too much. Also the energy, I can't remember what we said about that with energy. I put down like peopling nervous system.
Yes, so that was the contradiction where we need peopling to give us energy, but then our nervous system gets overstimulated and then we need to retreat. So it's the same sort of situation as the going to
parties.
a party.
That's it. Thank you for that. And then we finished off with, okay, so what are the points that as HSPs, both extrovert and introverts, what are the areas that we need to look at so that we can, the points that we need to sort of learn how to manage, right? And all of them apply to HSP extroverts and most of them to HSP introverts, but not all of them. So you have to see like which areas you feel that you need to consider. And the areas that Jenn explained was, one was the overthinking versus ruminating. Two was not taking, because we take things personally and how to sort of manage that. And we talked a lot about inner work on that. 3 was self-worth. 4 was doing too much. That's just not just the parties. That's also, overcommitting to like having too many to-do lists for our business. We do a website and then the marketing and then we'll network. It's just too much. We can't do that. And with that, we talked a lot about accountability and responsibility. And the 5th point is balancing the need for stimulation, both internal and external. And some of the tricks that was mentioned was to have a playlist. So what is it that rejuvenates you? What gives you happiness, peace, all this kind of stuff, and sort of learning how to nurture that and adding that, inserting that into your schedule, so that you actually maybe don't do too much of the things that drain you, right? So you have to sort of learning how to balance everything. And that's that. Would you say, is that a fair roundup of summary?
It was a very good roundup. Thank you.
So Jenn, absolute pleasure to have you back on today. Can you please tell people where they can find you and how they can work with you?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me back again, because it was fun once again. You can find me, the best place to hang out with me is in my free Facebook group, which is Highly Sensitive Extroverts Bright Sparks on Facebook. You can also go to my website, jennturnham.com, which is a work in progress. It's currently going through a bit of an upgrade so that I can make it more about highly sensitive extroverts. And in terms of working with me, I do one-on-one coaching. Those places are limited, obviously. And then I do offer self-paced courses. I mentioned a couple of them in today's episode. And I also have ongoing group coaching. I've got a membership that you can join for a pretty reasonable monthly price, and that's a weekly coaching session. And then I also have group programs, like about 8-week courses that I run on a regular basis throughout the year. But all of those will be talked about in the free Facebook group, so that's definitely the best place to come and hang out and meet other HSP extroverts as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much for today, Jenn.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
Bye.
Bye.
And that's our episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Please don't forget to rate, review, share it, subscribe it on iTunes, follow it on Spotify, or whichever platform you listen from. However you show love is how you can support this show. Drop me your questions or suggestions for future episodes via the website at angie-s.com, or come and find me on Instagram at Tool for This Shit Podcast. See you next week, and until then,
Using health inappropriately.